Mr. Nicholson, I'm just a secretary.
Dear viewers, tonight I invite you to step behind the dazzling smile of a woman who once embodied the very spirit of American innocence and joy. Doris Day. The name alone conjures images of a bright blonde sweetheart singing Que Sera Sera, while the world fell in love with her gentle voice and sparkling eyes. But behind that sunlit smile was a labyrinth of heartbreak and betrayal that few ever dared to imagine. She was America's sweetheart, yet her life was a battlefield shaped by the very men she trusted most. Husbands who raised their hand not only to sign papers that would ruin her, but sometimes to strike the body that millions adored. Lovers who whispered promises of forever, but left her alone with debts so crushing they would have broken a lesser spirit. How does a woman keep singing when her world is devoured by betrayal? How does she smile on camera while behind closed doors she braces for another storm? And when the final curtain falls, do the scars ever truly fade? Tonight, dear audience, I will take you through the shadows of Doris Day's life. The shadows cast by the men she loved, the men who betrayed her, and the bitterness that never quite let her go. Doris Day was more than a singer or an actress. She was a living symbol of post-war America's craving for something pure, gentle, and endlessly optimistic. From the moment her warm, crystalline voice floated through the airwaves with "Sentimental Journey," she became the nation's sweetheart, giving soldiers returning from battlefields a comforting dream of what home could be. She carried that innocence onto the silver screen, starring in classics like Pillow Talk and Calamity Jane. Her on-screen charm so irresistible that entire generations believed she lived in a world as flawless as her movies. In every photograph, Doris Day was sunshine itself. The studio executives knew it, the press played it up, and audiences soaked it in. The perfect American woman. Radiant smile, kind eyes, the wholesome blonde who never aged. She became Hollywood's balm, a promise that beneath all the scandals and heartbreak that plagued other stars, here was one untouched by the industry's darkness. But behind that glowing facade, Doris carried secrets she rarely let slip. Few knew that she had been married not once but 4 times, and that each man, in his own way, would chip away at her innocence. Fewer still realized that the smiling blonde who sang so sweetly was, behind closed doors, forced to fight battles that would have crushed many men of her time. To the world, she was the embodiment of a happy ending. The woman who could tame Rock Hudson's screenplay boy, who could make audiences believe that love conquers all. Yet the truth was, when the camera stopped rolling, Doris Day faced betrayals that no camera ever captured. Dear audience, this is the woman we thought we knew. But what about the men who left scars no spotlight could heal? Behind that legendary smile lay a young girl who, from the very start, learned that love could hurt more than it could heal. Doris Mary Ann Kappelhoff, as she was first known, was barely out of her teens when she married her first husband, Al Jordan, a dashing trombone player with a temper as sharp as the brass he played. They met while performing with Barney Rapp's band, and to a bright-eyed Doris, Al was a charismatic, intense musician who made her feel grown up and adored. But that warmth turned cold almost immediately after they wed. Al was a jealous man, consumed by a rage that boiled just beneath the surface. He accused Doris of unfaithfulness every time she stepped on stage, branding her ambition as betrayal. He would come home in the early hours, his anger stoked by whiskey, and Doris would flinch, bracing for fists that knew no mercy. When she became pregnant, the situation turned terrifying. Al demanded she get an abortion, convinced that a child would tie him down, trap him in a domestic life he despised. But Doris, ever the optimist even then, refused to yield. She believed that their baby could be the beginning of something better. Instead, it was the beginning of her first true heartbreak. When her son Terry was born, Doris tried to keep the family together. She endured Al's violence for the sake of giving Terry a father, hoping against hope that the man she loved would change. But one night, as Al's rage spiraled out of control, Doris realized that staying could mean not only losing herself, but losing her child too. She gathered the courage to flee, clutching Terry to her chest as if her life depended on it, because in truth, it did. Not long after freeing herself from Al's brutal grasp, Doris fell for George Weidler, a handsome saxophonist with a boyish charm that promised a fresh start. George was everything Al was not: polite, soft-spoken, and seemingly supportive of Doris's career. For a brief moment, she dared to believe that maybe this was the real thing, that perhaps she could finally have the simple love story she had always sung about. But the fairy tale faded as quickly as it came. George was young, restless, and uneasy about Doris's rising stardom. As her name climbed the charts and movie marquees, his ego shrank in its shadow. He resented the way people recognized her in public, how men admired her, how women envied her. In private, George's warmth turned to cold indifference. He began to spend more time away, leaving Doris alone with a growing suspicion that once again she had given her heart to someone who was never truly hers. When George walked out, it was almost without warning, dissolving their marriage with the same casualness he brought to their wedding vows. He left Doris with another scar, a reminder that the men she trusted could, and often would, vanish when she needed them most. In the public eye, none of this turmoil showed. Doris kept smiling, sang sweeter than ever, posed for photographs with that signature sparkle in her eyes. If the world guessed at the truth, they chose to look away. After all, why tarnish the myth of America's sweetheart? But behind closed doors, Doris Day was already learning that the cost of love could be devastating, and that sometimes the very people who claim to cherish you can become the source of your deepest wounds. And this was just the beginning. If Al Jordan and George Weidler had bruised her spirit, it was her third husband, Martin Melcher, who would devastate Doris Day in a way that no bruise or heartbreak ever could. Marty, as he was known in Hollywood circles, seemed at first to be the answer to her prayers. A man who promised not only love, but stability, protection, and a guiding hand through the treacherous world of show business. To the public, they were the perfect couple. The devoted manager husband and his radiant movie star wife, conquering the industry together. But the truth was that Marty Melcher was a master manipulator. Charming on the surface, he was shrewd, secretive, and relentless behind the scenes. He convinced Doris to sign over nearly every aspect of her professional life to him. Contracts, appearances, finances. She trusted him blindly. So grateful was she for a man who handled everything while she poured her heart into her performances. It never occurred to her to read the fine print or to question the investments he made in her name. While Doris sang to sold-out crowds and filmed one box office hit after another, Marty was making deals behind her back. He siphoned millions of dollars into risky ventures, bad real estate gambles, and dubious friends who used Doris's fame as their personal piggy bank. Through it all, he reassured her with warm words and a doting smile, telling her that every penny was safe, that their future was brighter than ever. But Marty's betrayal went deeper than bad investments. He locked Doris into a grueling work schedule she didn't even know she'd agreed to. One of the greatest shocks came after his sudden death in 1968, when Doris discovered that her beloved husband had committed her to a television series, The Doris Day Show, without her knowledge or consent. She learned about it from a room full of stunned executives, realizing in that instant that her life had been packaged and sold, while she blissfully trusted the man who shared her bed. And then came the final blow. Sorting through Marty's tangled accounts, Doris learned that not only was she not wealthy, she was millions of dollars in debt. The fortune she had worked her entire life for had evaporated, and the man who claimed to love her had left her to pay the price alone. The betrayal was so immense, so cruel in its scope, that for years Doris refused to speak publicly about it. Friends said she felt humiliated, used, and utterly broken. But Doris Day was no ordinary woman. Instead of collapsing under the weight of the deception, she gathered her resolve and took the matter to court. She sued her late husband's business partners and the law firm that had enabled him. The legal battle dragged on for years, dredging up every painful detail. And yet, through it all, she never let the world see her despair. She filmed her TV show with her trademark warmth, smiled for the cameras, and retreated to her dressing room to face stacks of legal documents that told the real story of the price she was paying for misplaced trust. In private, Doris confided to her closest friends that the hardest part was not the lost money. It was the knowledge that the man she thought would protect her from the cruelty of her past had been the cruelest of them all. "He stole my peace of mind," she once said, her voice trembling, "and he did it with a kiss goodnight." After Marty's death, Doris never remarried. She knew now that the men who once promised to cherish her had instead taught her a lesson she would carry to her grave, that sometimes the worst wounds are inflicted by those who say they love you most. When the dust settled and the final lawsuit was won, Doris Day stood before the world with her signature smile still intact. But inside, a different woman had emerged. The debts were slowly repaid, the wounds buried beneath layers of polite small talk and cheerful performances, but she knew she would never look at love the same way again. She had seen how easily a promise could curdle into a weapon, how the word husband could be more terrifying than comforting, and how her own trusting heart had betrayed her almost as cruelly as the men she married. So she made a choice that no one expected of America's sweetheart. She walked away. Doris retreated from the spotlight, moving to a quiet coastal home in Carmel Valley. There, the applause and betrayals of Hollywood felt like echoes from a past life. In their place was the simple, unjudging company of dozens of dogs, the rescued souls she called her kids with fur. Where men had taken advantage of her devotion, these animals gave her unconditional love, a kind that asked for nothing and never lied. In interviews, Doris spoke sparingly of the men who had marked her life. She forgave them, she insisted, because to hold on to hate was to give them power over her joy. But in her eyes was a depth that told another story. The sparkle was still there, but now it danced above the shadows of memories she would never fully share. "I have forgiven," she said once, looking out at her garden where her dogs played. "But I will never forget. Maybe that's how I stay strong." Friends who visited her in Carmel often found her in the garden at dawn, hair pulled back, cup of coffee in hand, surrounded by wagging tails and gentle barks. There was no trace of the studio lots, the spotlight, the husbands who had once laid claim to her fortune and her heart. Here, Doris Day finally found a version of love that could not betray her. Love that licked her hand, curled at her feet, and stayed loyal until the end. In her final years, Doris became an advocate for animal welfare, founding the Doris Day Animal Foundation. Her voice, once used to charm millions, now spoke for the voiceless. And perhaps, in giving her love to those who could never lie to her, she found the peace that all the men in her life had stolen piece by piece. When you look at the smiling photographs of Doris Day, do you see just the blonde icon singing sweet ballads and living a fairy tale life? Or do you now see the woman who carried betrayal like a ghost, drifting beside her even in her brightest moments? Can any heart truly heal when the deepest wounds are carved by the very people who vowed to protect it? In the end, Doris Day chose not to let bitterness consume her. She turned her back on the world that had both adored and deceived her, finding solace in the gentle warmth of creatures who never judged her fame or her failings. But do you believe forgiveness can ever really erase the scars of such betrayal? Fame, money, adoration. They are fragile illusions when trust is broken behind closed doors. Doris's story reminds us that sometimes the cost of loving the wrong people is paid not in dollars, but in the silent hours when the stage lights go dark. So, dear audience, the next time you hum "Que sera, sera," ask yourself, did she ever truly believe that whatever will be, will be? Or did Doris Day spend a lifetime learning that even America's sweetheart must guard her heart from those who promise forever?